The button of unknown has been pressed. What will be talked about in this podcast today?
Probably an abortion of logic from many angles.
Oh.
Probably starting with the apparent overturning or suspected overturning of Roe v. Wade, with an unprecedented leaking of a report involving that judicial decision, which is very unprecedented.
And there are many nuances to this. It could be anything from just because the judicial branch has released an opinion, will that result in anything further within that branch? And then does that affect or influence the legislation at the state level or at the federal level for something? Are we ruling and living our lives based on judicial conclusions, or is there a legislative portion that will rebalance or allow this conclusion to continue down its path? It's very difficult to, I don't think that there's a black and white version of the legality of this as well as the morality of this.
Right. Absolutely. It is a difficult topic to explore because you and I, and for our audience out there, we're not pro abortion by any means, but we do accept and recognize that there's nuances to these conversations that are often overlooked by either side, who really want to downplay any of the needed nuance that occurs with the topic.
Yes, sometimes I think about this, for example, with cancer. Oh, there's a cure for cancer. But cancer is also so nuanced because there's so many types of cancer, different stages of cancer. Everything really has to be treated with that nuance. And the same can be said for the blanket term or the umbrella term of abortion, which is the final act that happens. And you can have, for example, a spontaneous abortion, which is the mother herself, her body is hostile to the fetus and will not support the fetus, which results in a stillbirth.
Right, and which has historically, and I think we need to point this out too, it has historically in some areas been cause for that mother getting either legally fined or jail time. So for as cut and dry as abortion could seem on the surface, I think a lot of people need to realize that if you're pro life, let's say, and of course these two sides that we're familiar with are very idiotically marketed with their own terminology, which is supposed to be a polemic device to bring people to their side.
Yes, I agree.
So it's not at all that we're talking about a simple cut and dry act that as soon as we institute one specific law, then some sort of grand morality would shine upon our country or some shit like that. Which is already upsetting enough that people kind of have this outlook. And if you're enraged right now, then good. Maybe you'll listen. But what we're talking about here is like a complicated situation in which you have clear biological processes that we've recognized conflicting with some sort of encroaching ideal.
Yes. Oh, that's a good term to use, ideal. Because in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. I heard that online, and I think it's supposed to be a quote from Yogi Berra. I heard, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is.
Oh, it's very good. That's very good. So if we dissect this thing, okay, so like we're talking about a top-down environment in which they're saying that this specific action that occurs where a fetus dies, either by removal via, like we're usually assuming artificial means. But as we
Yes.
know of, and which you have explained before, which you could again possibly for the guests, but spontaneous abortion is a thing. Stillbirths are a thing. Miscarriages are a thing. And
Yes.
historically, there have been repercussions for those women in certain areas, which, if that sounds asinine to you, that's because it is. That really, I think, goes beyond the pale. Like, why are you being punished for some sort of biological process that you can't handle?
And some of those are very difficult claims to prove intent on. A woman could be in such a toxic environment and exposed to environmental stressors that create an environment that causes the body to say, you know what, I can only support the primary organism. I cannot support any offspring at this time. It could be any number of things. Or the woman could create that toxic environment for her fetus through ingestion of certain chemicals. Or, if mom smokes and drinks and does cocaine and crystal methamphetamine all day long and takes pharmaceuticals that are known to cause crazy birth defects of really anything, like tiny brain, no arms, just simplifying, organs that are all messed up, or cleft palate, no teeth, no nose, no eyes. Can we hold mom responsible for that when the consequences are known and have been shown to be directly linked to certain lifestyle factors? That's And then
Even
there's
in,
also
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
just trying to explore the many different untoward outcomes of a baby that is born with many problems that are life impairing and permanently disrupt the normal functioning physiology and anatomy of a baby. It's how do we hold anybody? How do we assign culpability to that? And then there are also, in addition to the number of times that are hard to quantify where the sperm and the egg fuse, there is a zygote, which is where all biological textbooks agree this is where a new life form begins. Whether you agree with terminating that life form is a separate debate, but life begins when the zygote is formed, because that's when you have a new cell line. That's universally agreed upon. But even after you have that zygote, the zygote could fail to implant properly on the uterine wall. And that's the very first type of an abortion, because there was a life form and it was failing to implant, so it can't get nutrition, so it dies in the uterus or is expelled before it just makes its way out of the uterus and dies. That's a death. And then there's an ectopic pregnancy, which is almost never talked about. So the ovary where the egg comes out of, it's not connected directly to the fallopian tube, the uterine tube, and the egg actually has to jump to the fimbriae, which is like these little small petals, like tentacles kind of. And so there's a space there, there's a gap, like a bridge that's missing a few planks of wood in the center. And the egg has to jump that, and or the sperm can also jump the opposite direction towards the egg. So you can have a zygote, which becomes the fetus later on, and it can travel throughout the body. You can have a pregnancy inside your abdomen. You can have a pregnancy inside the fallopian tube before it makes it to the uterus. So if it implants anywhere else in the body, that cannot be a viable fetus, and that will threaten the mother, and she will die from that. And when you have a dead mom, you will soon have a dead baby. So you may be able to reasonably make the argument, I would at least like one of those people to survive. And I know I use the term people, and there's an argument to be had about what is personhood. How do you define personhood? And if there is a dependent and independent organism and one depends on the other, is it a person? Well, if I have a 1-year-old and I just leave them in a forest, are they going to survive? No, because they're dependent on mom. So there's a lot of nuance to this technical argument. But so in the cases of ectopic pregnancy, to finish this up, a procedure would have to be performed if we did not want both of them to die, because the end result of an ectopic pregnancy is death. And then even if mom does not immediately die from this fetus is unviable. It's not going to get the nutrients that it needs. And then it will become a necrotic, decomposing, rotting organism within the mother. And that will create a massive infection, which will kill the mother. You will not be able to remove through cellular digestion a baby that is not in your uterus. That will not happen. So
it's a very scary thing. And I think you've done a really great job nailing all those points, including those of personhood. So I think it's one of those things that, like, when we are talking about this topic, we really have to expand our borders on what we mean by, because I feel like we would have that person out there who's pro-life rolling their eyes. They're like, well, of course we would have something like that in place. And I would say to them, I'm not so sure, because we have actual historical records of this sort of exact thing going awry in our society. So if we already have those sorts of problems where we have doctors who no longer want to be any, like, they would be the people qualified in order to take care of these specific issues involving pregnancies that have gone astray. They would purposely distance themselves from these sorts of things because they don't want to be threatened, because they have received threats by people who view their, unfortunate, I guess, like, unfortunate service to be misconstrued as, something that is worth exploiting.
Medical necessity should be determined. There should be relative criteria that can be applied as a general metric. It doesn't have to be black and white. There is obviously a lot of nuance here, and the lines in the sand are not universal, and they should accommodate the variety of situations which can occur. So, for example, even though I just provided in my opinion, a strong argument for the necessity of abortion in that specific circumstance, I also think it is very cruel to life. For example, if you have a DNX abortion, which is a legal workaround where if you can have abortion up to the actual point of birth. So if I deliver the baby completely and the head comes out and I end its life, that's murder. But with a partial birth abortion, I can partially deliver the baby, turn it around in such a way that its head is still in the vaginal canal. Then I take a pair of scissors, stab it through the spinal cord, pop it open, and then use a vacuum to suck its brains out. That's not murder because the body has not been fully birthed from the mother. So that's functionally the exact same mechanism of death, but it's just the placement of the head of the baby. So it's a loophole. And I think that that's pretty terrible, because at that point in time, this baby feels pain. So it's suffering. It has brainwaves, heartbeat. And my own beliefs are just that we need humans, we need brains, because the organic brain is the most magnificent creation given to us by this universe. And the collective brain power of all humans on this planet will allow us to do more magnificent actions than any other species that we know of. We could become a spacefaring species, an interstellar multiplanetary species with our pooled collective brain power. And any loss of life, I think, is mostly tragic, especially when it's an innocent life which has not done anything except existed and receives the ultimate terminal punishment. It seems unjust to me, but that's just what I think.
Absolutely. I'm really, you are hitting some really excellent points here, because that's an excellent point on the, what I would consider traditional other side, even though, like I said before, we are kind of trying to explore as many pathways to kind of etch out the nuance of this topic, because again, we would probably have to go back to the issue then of personhood. So even though life begins at a very particular point, where does personhood begin? And that's a very difficult thing to explore. But I can't deny that what you said about those legal workaround abortions feels
And
absolutely
I bring that one up
correct.
specifically. I bring it up specifically to show two opposing examples that I think are fairly clear cut, or at least more clear cut than other areas. So now these two opposite lines can start to approach each other and say, okay, how does the situation change when this variable is changed or this variable is changed?
Yes.
And we can really start to paint a picture that it's actually a rather complicated situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like, it's sometimes like, I understand the purpose of people making some sort of comparison. Sometimes they're just not helpful. Like, I've never really found the argument that, the same people who believe in pro-life are also pro-death penalty. And like, I get what seems to be like an obvious sort of irony around there, but it's really not that similar. And I have a hard time, like, I guess, like finding it's just like, it's such a bad comparison that it doesn't feel like it really helps the conversation that much. Which isn't to say that there's nothing wrong with the death penalty. I don't think that a modern society like ours really needs the death penalty. I think something like life in jail, which is pretty much a proxy for the death penalty, obviously can be improved upon, because you can improve the conditions of those sorts of things, even though people may not want to. And I understand it is like a whole complicated situation. But I think a lot of us need to recognize that life is not clear cut at all. And a lot of these situations are very unique. And they introduce a whole set of new variables that really have to be considered, which muddy the water everywhere. That we're not Siths here. We're not dealing in absolutes.
Yes. And unfortunately, the easiest way to argue is to simplify the argument or straw man the argument, where you it's not that you're misrepresenting the opposition necessarily, but we're forced to not include every detail of the opposing opinion,
which is relevant.
It could be relevant and is likely relevant. And at the same time, it also serves a purpose to make a point. For example, you could say, so the judicial branch said, we don't think that our branch of government should be clearing people to terminate life. And then people online say, I don't understand why this country hates women so much. It's like, well, they didn't say that you couldn't do it. They just said, we don't think that we should be the ones telling you if you can or cannot. And I also just use the straw man argument there to represent people online as, but there is a video online of a woman, or at least, she appears to be a biological woman, to saying that. I also, throughout this entire intro, have been saying that women have babies because that's the most well understood version. I understand that there are people who would rather me say birthing person or person who has the child. But to me, I think that using the biological sexes is an acceptable frame of reference to argue this, to navigate this landscape.
Right. And like when we use the engendered pronouns, it's a proxy more or less. We're just talking about the sexes. That's what we mean when we're talking about this. So yeah, you could argue that what we're doing is unhelpful, but I honestly don't really care about those arguments, and I don't care about the people who make them. I don't really find them to be good faith actors.
So. I acknowledge that they exist, but that's a separate point that they should be able to, if that really bothers anybody, they should be able to overlook it for the purposes of this argument. Because if you only move forward when there's perfection and idealism, then you never end up going anywhere because you're paralyzed by inaction.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can't even
taking my ball and going home.
They can't even be self-conscious enough. Like that's, I think, my problem with it is that they're never self-reflective enough about their own position to include any nuance on their own that they can introduce to the argument that would make their position stand more firmly.
There is some inherent irony there, because our entire podcast so far has been about the nuance and acknowledging the nuance.
And yet when we speak, we want to convey ideas. I think the insidious thing about strawman arguments is that sometimes they're just done unconsciously, which, obviously I think we're all guilty of in some level, but there's like a natural efficiency that comes from us conversing at a level in which we either assume certain things or those are those instances in which we actually do a deeper dive on. So
yeah, you're right. There is definitely an efficiency that is brought about by necessarily simplifying things. Also, just for the sake of time, we have a limited time on this planet. So sometimes we have to accommodate, and that's okay. We should be accommodating of those accommodations and forgiving of his argument wasn't 1000% correct. Throw the whole thing out. We can't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, absolutely. Although there is something to be said about the personhood thing, which I think we keep touching on, but we're not fully exploring. And I do just want to touch on this a little bit before we kind of move on to other points, because I think people also need to recognize that traditionally, when you're in a philosophy program and you're doing bioethics, you will undoubtedly come across a situation of someone like Terry Schiavo, or someone who is brain dead, but somehow their biological processes are continuing just because of the nature of their accident or condition. And what we do in those situations as these sort of dependent people seem to lack personhood. They seem to not be conscious anymore. And that really is an important topic to explore when you're the person who has to foot the bill for them to continuously be, kept alive, so to speak. Because a lot of these people, their biological processes, they're not just obviously they can be kept going, but it's always done artificially, whether that's through feeding tubes or something like that. They can't physically get up and even eat an apple. There's no motion that's occurring with their mechanical system.
Yeah, they got a tube in their ass to catch their poop. They got a straw in their penis or vagina to catch their urine. They have feeding tubes to give them food, and they have a ventilator to breathe for them. And you got a polyfarm experiment going on, trying to keep the chemistry of the body functional. So, is that really is that person?
Is it a person? That is really the question.
Yeah.
Which is obviously it's not a joyful thing that we want to engage in, topically to discuss, but it's something that has to be, because you could see the obvious corollaries between this and a very early stage fetus. So we have just a complex array of economic situations, sociological situations. The case of rape is always one that's brought up too, where you just have kind of more or less like, yeah, I am transitioning a little bit here from like personhood to like an undesirable pregnancy, which I think is where we get kind of like hung up with the if you know that this child is going to be born brain dead, if you know this child is going to be born with severe deformities, there's got to be some sort of out, because it's not really fair to the parents to be more or less cursed like this. And I've even heard it from, now this is also anecdotal, so I don't want to like base my argument on it, but there's a lot of people with severe deformities who said that they were wish they were never born, whose bodies are so, damaged, and they were forced to kind of grow up like this, that even they would be the ones to admit that they don't prefer to be like this, obviously. And maybe that's just, a temporary thing on their part, and I shouldn't be too quick to use this as a justification, but I think, you can see where I'm going with like the larger conversation to be had on the nature between our desires and freedoms versus what is the role of government in this sort of conversation. In order for society to impose something like that, there are pathways then that exceed beyond the simple abortion topic, that lead us to areas of the government encroaching in other areas of our personhood and our biological processes that are very undesirable.
This is a good area to venture into, and it's a bit foggy. And I think one of the agents of causality is who is making the decision to terminate the life. Is it the organism themselves, or is it someone else? And ideally, I would always like to see the organism that dies, in this case, the human, as opposed to someone else. So when you're pulling the plug, so to speak, and you're terminating life support on someone who is in the hospital, that's someone else making that choice. And we recognize that it weighs heavily on the conscious, because I think we see more of a personhood with them than with a baby that we haven't gotten to know, doesn't have a name. We don't know their behavior, their characteristics. And for these people who have said, I wish I were never born, maybe their opinion wasn't originally that, or maybe it becomes that and stays that way, or maybe it becomes that and then reverts back to, and they say, you know what? No, I have a new perspective, and I'm glad that I'm alive, even though my life is not normal, so to speak. And in an ideal situation, even if mom thinks my baby will not have a good life, I'm ending it and I'm not giving it that chance. I would, if you're just looking at a few variables, I would rather them have the child and then let that person decide later on, you know what, this was garbage, I'm ending it, and then they commit suicide or something like that. Because then at least I would say the choice is better in their hands than having someone else make that decision for them.
Right, which is why we outlaw murder to begin with.
Yeah.
There seems to be like a base logic that's kind of behind all this that encompasses the relationship we have between choice of life and death when we either have it available, or if it just becomes an inevitability. It's inevitable that we're all going to die at this point, unless some sort of other
Life is terminal. The diagnosis of life is death.
Absolutely. And we do like something I want to mention too, because maybe I'm sounding too callous, but like I absolutely believe that motherhood is an extremely beautiful thing. And obviously I appreciate my own mother and the sacrifices she's made in order to make my life possible. And that's a very human thing that I think we can all agree on.
I expect you to tell her that tomorrow on Mother's Day.
I will. Actually, it's a weirdly timed conversation to be had, but yeah, we have to love mothers and look after them and recognize the sacrifice that they've made for all of us to have existed, because each and every one of us come from a mother of sorts.
Yes, Dave Chappelle said that very well, which you can argue about many different definitions about semantics and the definition of things, but given our current medical capabilities and technologies, everybody on this planet who has ever existed so far in history has come into this world through a mother's legs. They came from another organism that grew them inside. That person was a woman who had a uterus, who had an egg and a sperm inside of her, whether through sexual intercourse or through some sort of other in vitro fertilization technique. But that baby was birthed from a mother.
Yep, absolutely. And I want to say that in conclusion to my whole, I guess, opinion currently on the topic, and this could change over the years, obviously. I am someone who adopts new viewpoints as new information comes along, new lines of reasoning, which I think is a reasonable position to have. But one minute. Ultimately, what I'm getting to is that I think the choice has to default to the mother, and we support her in what she chooses at this time. It's a huge undertaking, and it's her sacrifice to make. And because it is her sacrifice to make, her body is used for the sole purpose of creation of the child when she's undergoing pregnancy. I think we have to support them in any way that we can. And I don't really like the idea of abortions just because of economic forces that aren't really, being ideal, or, there's like a selfish argument, I guess, that some people point to that that a lady is being irresponsible or yada, yada, yada. But I don't think that's their choice to make. And I think especially as Americans too, like we need to not allow other people to be the sole voice on these sorts of really important decisions.
I have a few sporadic points that are not necessarily linear, but I think that are tangentially or indirectly related, like the idea of punishment involving abortion is interesting. So this is an oversimplified argument, I admit that, but so man rapes woman, woman gets pregnant, woman has an abortion, terminating that life. It seems out of place. What might make more sense is man rapes woman, woman kills man, woman has baby, baby is given up for adoption. And even if our adoption services are not great and the social services provided are not A+, that's not really, just because that's not perfect doesn't mean that the opposite should be the chosen action. Like, oh, well, it's not a good life, so therefore they should die. It just seems like we're punishing the wrong person many times. And then there's also at least according to most official statistics, which yes, they can be argued how accurate they are, but most of them would say the cited reasons reported for abortions because of conception due to rape is like 0.5% of all abortions. Yes, those numbers could be misreported, or people don't want to admit that they were raped for their abortion, but that statistics still should be a consideration if a large number of them are elective And also, how many weeks along is it? Do my taxpayer dollars have to pay for that? And also, even if we have a lot of disagreement about where to meet people, like, oh, meet me halfway, that along those lines, what about prevention in the first place? Because I personally would be more than happy to provide universal birth control. And I know, like, oh, birth control could be a form of supporting the patriarchy, because why is it only for women? Why isn't there birth control for men? Well, it's because I think we make like 5 million sperm a day or something. Like, it's an insane number, and I think that it's at least that number, but it's a lot easier to stop on average 1 egg per month than to stop an army of 500 or 5 million per month per day or something. I really wish I had that statistic or that number, but you can look it up on your search engine, how many sperm a man produces. It's an insane number. So even if you stop 75% of them, or you find a way to stop 90% of them, it's much harder to achieve a successful block on sperm, I think, than it is to stop an egg. And if we can just avoid this argument, or if we can stop 99% of these pregnancies that result in the conversation that needs to be had about, hey, do I keep my pregnancy or do I go get an abortion? Then regardless of, if nothing changes at all, but the number of unwanted pregnancies dramatically declines, that's still a massive win. And that's, I think both sides would say that that's a win for their side as well, because you can still do whatever you want, and you can also have fewer deaths of the most magnificent and advanced life form that has existed to our knowledge so far in human history.
There's all sorts of strange branches that this conversation can go on, and I think that's what we want to point people towards, is that, you know, it's very much fundamentally at this crux of life and death, and this conversation can easily ebb and flow between different topics that are very much related. Birth control, and even I don't really want to say propagandizing, but, you know, in any sort of way, shape, or form that we either force generations to, like, the way I'm thinking about it now is, you know, of course, with student loans, you have situations where, and Elon Musk has talked about this, where, you know, we're getting started way later, having families and stuff like that too. And that feels at least tangentially related to this conversation. You know, you're kind of economically forcing people into like specific decision trees, because it's no longer viable to, you know, have a certain lifestyle which is comfortable or even viable for a family, especially with like something with, you know, having student loans, but also having huge amounts of inflation. The fact that our wages aren't really moving, our median wages aren't moving. You know, this has to also be a consideration onto the raising and rearing of children. So you can't have preventative measures that specifically target actions like abortion, I think, without also talking about a grander worldview of child rearing to begin with. So it's crazy that, like,
that makes sense. If you adjust one part of the system, then you have to address the concerns of that. You know, when you're at the science museum and they have like a giant sloped thing of sand, and you can put up barricades to redirect the water. That water goes somewhere else and erodes the sand elsewhere. So you have to address the entire topography of the landscape.
It's a whole ecosystem. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and
yes,
law works that way too. I'm really glad you used that example, because it's exactly what we're talking about. The barricades are laws in this way, in certain ways, and it's, I guess, just, it can be really confusing. I'm confused right now a little bit too. There's just so much information. Yeah,
if it works,
consider.
so if it were really clear cut, there would not be dissenting opinions and disagreements. And
Mhm.
I think both sides probably think that there are crazy people on both sides, and there probably are crazy people on all sides of this. Like even my own beliefs and opinions on this, uh, I would tend to be more of the pro-life side, but it's not even because of a religious basis. It's because of my appreciation and my view of the value of Homo sapiens sapiens and how the life form is so valuable that we should make all attempts to keep them, and then allow, if they are to be removed, I all attempts should be made to put that decision in the hands of that organism, just because that's my personal philosophy. And maybe that's a strange philosophy to many people, that a lot of people just say, oh, well, because God says it's wrong, or my body, my choice. Even my own opinion is kind of like nuanced in how I came to this conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I tend to agree. I feel like I have to be pro-choice because we're specifically talking about a situation in which a government is deciding these sorts of enforcement actions to take.
The
So for
government
me,
never does anything very well.
no, it really doesn't, and that's why I'm more or less an anarchist. Ideally, I would say, I think it's pretty suboptimal that we probably do have to have government and blah blah blah, sort of like the lowest amount of government possible, functionally possible is kind of my goal, more or
So
less.
is libertarian a form of anarchy? Minimum baseline anarchy?
I think there's a continuum. The way that I see it, a lot of people probably wouldn't agree with me, but I see it as a continuum of libertarianism being least amount of government possible. So yeah, like you could say that like functionally I'm libertarian, ideally I'm anarchist.
Oh, okay. That's a pretty good way to look at it.
Because I know like some people too talk about anarchy kind of more or less in the scope of like leftist philosophy, being that of like true communism, or they'll do like anarcho-syndicalism, of it being more about like a leftist philosophy, and those people consider libertarianism more of like a right-leaning philosophy, but I think those political compasses are broken. So I'm not really trying to push one versus the other, but because I feel more or less that like we still need free markets, like just the baseline of like if I want to sell ice cream, there shouldn't be like this huge complicated fucking network of switches and levers I have to pull in order to get like an application from the government so they can lean me like a certain amount of dairy cow, whatever. It's just, I think it's ridiculous. And I think people make much better decisions when they're faced with the blacks directly in the way of their desires, that they're able to negotiate with other
There
people.
there have been young children who have had their lemonade stand shut down and told to cease and desist by police officers in the United States under the authority of the government and direction of them, because they did not have a permit. So nothing permitted them to sell lemonade at deeply discounted rates to other citizens. That's a health and public safety violation, as well as failure to have a permit. Is that where we want government? And is that what we want our police being told to do, to go shut down Susie's lemonade stand?
Absolutely. And I feel like this sort of exact situation is what I view socialism and communism as being. That I think people need to realize, at least in my view, and what I want to share with other people is more or less the fact that like government and corporations aren't that different. They really aren't. Like you just literally have a title difference, and that's it. They're just
Mm.
groups of people trying to collude to do a specific thing. If I were to take it from a historical standpoint, we've never not had markets and never not had government. So in a certain way, I think I'm forced to admit that some sort of governance has to exist. But because I'm at least ideally anarchist, I'd like to like push it in that direction always. Maybe we have some sort of technological advancement which allows us to go more in one direction versus the other. But I view it as a constantly shifting landscape that I'm completely okay with just sort of like not having any sort of firm ground. It's not necessary for me to have any firm ground in any one of these camps, because ultimately I'm just trying to find what works for the most people because I view truth and freedom and beauty as like these things that we should be geared towards. But I don't want to, obviously because freedom's incorporated with that, there's no reason why I should force anything upon anyone.
It's reasonable. I think
I hope
that's
so.
actually
And
something.
if it's not, I'll reflect on it.
Yeah, you and I are both willing to be dynamic, and nobody's perfect. So we can all reflect, and life is a continual improvement process. It ebbs and flows, and we adjust and fine tune things. We simply can't know everything.
Absolutely. I think ultimately, if we're to come down to the legality argument with abortion, I would have to conclude that because something like the ability to choose not to have an abortion is in the realm of like with pro-choice, you are offered two positions, whereas pro-life, you're really only offered one. And I think there's a lot that can go wrong, especially if that argument is used, if this sort of argument of protecting life is used in different areas. And I think about that with like forced vaccinations and any other,
Mm.
like keeping euthanasia illegal, that sort of stuff. There's like a legality argument that like because the same sort of logic is used in one area, it can be used in other areas. And this is the thing that people should be focusing on a little bit more than the specifics of either pro-life or pro-choice.
Although I think there is a difference. You make good points, but there's a difference between providing purported care in a way that prevents death, which may or may not happen without that intervention. Like if I don't get
Mm-hmm.
the COVID vaccine, maybe I still live. If I do get the COVID vaccine, maybe I still live. The outcome could be the same with or without that. Whereas with an abortion, the outcome is determined and final. But there is an interesting, unfortunately, this is also nuanced, but I'm looking at a picture right now that says the Nazis had a phrase which covered all abuses by the state. And forgive my abhorrent German pronunciation, but it says something like "Für eure Sicherheit," which means it's for your safety. And I agree with. Um, we should not allow the government to control our lives with giving them unlimited control under the guise of safety or protection. Um, I don't know if that completely applies to forcing people to keep a baby, but
It feels like the law would have to be written in such a very specific way in order to not allow, like we talked about before, punishment to occur in situations in which it's outside of the mother's hands, which seems like a reasonable position to have.
I also admit that there are irreconcilable portions of my own pro-life viewpoints, such as rabbits. So rabbits can and do smother their own offspring when they think that there's something wrong with them. And this is essentially a post-birth abortion. And they don't want to give them resources. So they smother their babies, and male lions go in and kill other offspring that are produced by a different male. And that's nature. And I don't know if we can assign a right or wrong to what nature does, but it certainly occurs and it happens. And
Mhm.
I know that humans we're not rabbits, we're not lions, but there is a similarity. And I don't know how to reconcile that in the same way that I wash my hands and I kill millions of bacteria. And also, there is a silent war inside my body where my own body, through autonomous processes of my immune system, is constantly waging war and killing life forms inside me, pathogens from bacteria to viruses to other parasites. Many people are killing worms inside their body right now. Death happens. It's violent. There's violent all throughout nature, throughout history, inside our bodies. And I don't know if all of it's right or wrong. And I am a mass murderer every time I wash my hands.
No,
You know,
absolutely.
it's a, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, it's just that generalized principle that Carl Sagan used to say, that like extinction is the norm, survivability is the exception. And so
Hmm.
like we do value life because of the sort of situation that 99% of all species have ever gone extinct. I think what we're also talking about is that there's a strange relationship we have between the generality of protecting life, um, when we can, but that also seems to have its own exceptions of, like, if a bear is threatening you inside the woods and your family, and you have the ability to kill the bear, you kill the bear, and it's, even though you would like it to be otherwise, there are certain things that just have to be done in order to, for other reasons, like we have specific reasons because there have to be reasons for that specificity that differentiate it from the generality.
Yes. And we terminate life forms all the time, even if you're a vegetarian, a vegan, or even a jadist. And I apologize if I mispronounced that one, but so for example, oh, I just eat plants because I don't want to kill animals, but they're perfectly okay with killing a different type of life form. And I'm not sure that they can reconcile that. Or how do you reconcile the history that preceded how we got to this point, which was being essentially paleo gatherers and hunters? And also, so a jadist is somebody who doesn't even want to hurt a plant. So they would argue that even, and I'm sorry if you're a jadist out there and I'm misrepresenting or simplifying your beliefs, but so they don't even want to pull fruit off a plant because that's stressful or damaging to the plant. You can think of that as you will, but they might pick up fruit that's already on the ground. But guess what? There's pathogens on that. So it's still, you can never fully address the massive amount of life destruction that your body produces with or without your consent.
Yeah, I still think that we're fundamentally tribal, that, the locus of our focus is kin based, and then it kind of has like a branching path out from there, because we recognize that cooperation is a very useful tool to have for our own survival. So, we have all of these different branching sorts of paths that are going on here, and a very conflictive history involving past versions of our cultures that have engaged in, very um, euthanasic sort of, or not euthanasia, what am I thinking of? Eugenics, like
Uh,
eugenical practices, like the Spartans, for example, the famous
the
sort of, yeah, like mountain of dead babies.
Yeah, if only Ephialtes ended up there too, then our brave warriors might still be alive.
I mean, that is the conclusion of that story, right? Like, that's one of the
So,
factors.
this is why we did that. One escaped. Now, the
Yeah, like,
number,
pretty much, unfortunately, that like justifies it, which I think leaves a bad taste in our mouth because we want to respect life, but I think we haven't done a good job in figuring out the internal consistency between all of our morals.
mm,
And I think that's probably because we see processes in a biological world that have conflicted, I think, with our like traditional, ethical bases, which do come in the form of like, yeah, we have to be honest, like this Judeo-Christian background. But then, like, even if you look in the Bible, you have all of these weird contradictions that you don't know how to handle. It's like, okay, God apparently likes life unless he decides to wipe it out with a flood. And then he promises not to do it again, but he's God, so he can do whatever he wants, I guess.
take your child and cut him in half for me.
Yeah, I don't know why like Yahweh of the Old Testament was just such a brutal dude, turning people into pillars of salt and shit.
Well, he was a brutal dude because he was a man, and men are evil, even though there's no definition for that. So we don't even know what a man or a woman is. So
But
we're
God
left
knows
with
because he
that.
knows everything. I'm just saying that there's a lot of these logic games that we don't really know what to do with.
Yeah, there really are. I'm thinking about a thought experiment right now where I'm like, what's the minimum number of people an organism can kill? Not even one, because even if you kill yourself, um, like I don't want to commit any more murder, and I'm either killing plants or animals or pathogens when I wash my hands, and the stomach acid inside my body when like there's staph and all sorts of bacteria right now on our eyelashes, on our skin, living on many different surfaces, exteriorly, interiorly in our bodies. Anything I consume is not sterile, so my stomach acid kills things, and then everything else is taken care of by my immune system. And even in my feces, there's bacteria. And if I kill myself, then I will not be contributing to any further death. But wrong, because then everything that was a host mechanism inside you, relying on you and your continued body processes, all those organisms die. So you're forced to live because if you die, then you are causing further death for
It's
everything that's living
yeah,
inside of you. Like you can't win. You're a
which
murderer. Everybody in the audience, you're a murderer. I hope you can accept that. Learn to live with your murderous nature.
that's a really funny way to put it, and it's absolutely true. I mean,
Un-
there's no way around it. There's also like a weird obsession though. Like, why does everyone have this obsession with being like this weird, morally pure being?
Unconscious
To
bias. How about unconscious murderer?
I mean, I think it's good to strive for some sort of like ethical balance within your life and in our society. And I think we can all agree that like murdering people just creates like this whole snowball effect of constant murder that, is very suboptimal for the way that we like to live. So like peace is kind of more or less, I wouldn't say like this ethical paradise that we're striving for. It's more or less like a device we use in order to live more efficient lives. And we do have like efficiency in our lives, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that or look down upon that. I think it's actually like kind of beautiful because we are, I think, like gearing ourselves towards going to space. So we realize that like we just have to engage in some of these practices, even if they cause us internal friction. But we'll navigate the landscape well enough, I think. Even in spite of ourselves, even our bumbling around. Um, if we strive to be better human beings, first we have to define what that is, of course, and then we have to somehow create processes in which all of that stuff is fulfilled. But we can't because we're imperfect, and I think we can kind of like, I wouldn't say use that as like a way to justify our shortcomings, but we can also just say that like, hey, look, it's like physically impossible for me to be perfect. So there's also like a biological aspect of the argument, which we're just stuck in these suboptimal sort of cycles, and that's okay. It's nothing to be like really stressed over. And even if you are morally perfect, I mean, you could probably still, you'll still end up dead like the rest of us. It's like that skeleton inside the thing. It's like, oh man, that meme in which they have all the different skeletons that are like, like I worked out every day. And then the second one is like I ate vegan every day. And the third one is like, I never broke a law. The whole idea that we're just all going towards the grave anyway should kind of give us a little bit more leeway and understanding towards each other, and hopefully more patience with each other too. Like, just have some humility. We don't have this figured out. It's a really difficult way to handle society and language and our shortcomings and biology and our desires for certain things to happen.
I completely agree. And I just looked up something interesting as a final point of absurdity for my other argument of the death that you cause by killing yourself, by trying to remove yourself from causing further death. I thought, okay, so there's mitochondria, which is the mitochondria in our bodies. They're the factory of energy for all of our cells. And it's actually a separate organism that has its own DNA. It replicates on its own. And there's a symbiotic relationship. We give them nutrients and resources to survive and produce energy, and they produce energy for us. It's like, wow, if you die, how many of those do you kill? And apparently, according to online, we cannot estimate the mitochondrial count in the human body because there are so many variables that you get about, if you're looking at how many cells are in the human body. So we're all made of cells, and each cell has many mitochondria. So each human has about anywhere from 15 trillion to 70 trillion cells in our body. And the Smithsonian Magazine article has their final count averaged at 37.2 trillion. So some of those have a lot of mitochondria, like our muscle cells. Our muscles require a lot of energy. Our sperm have a lot of energy. They need that motility to power through, and we make a lot of sperm. So 37.2 trillion times some average number of mitochondria. So an average times an average number of cells times average number of mitochondria. And then when you die, all of them die. So when you die, you are a murderer. It's your magnum opus of death. the final solution, if you will. So that's the final point of absurdity that I wanted to say.
No, it's a good point. It's a pretty hilarious point too. And like it also then it's like, okay, so the logic that follows from that too is like if more life is more valuable, then overweight people are more valuable, and people who are also like heavy weightlifters also more valuable because they're just creating more mitochondria because their body, is forced into those stressful positions. And when they rebuild, someone like who am I thinking of? Just like those famous weightlifters, like the Mountain from Game of Thrones. I don't remember his name, Thorson, something or another. He's like the 6'8" Icelandic dude.
Oh, okay.
Literally, by this definition, if more life is more valuable, then he's doing all that he can just by being. He's literally more valuable than other human beings because he's just got more meat. and therefore people, is housing to more organism.
And people who are dying in the hospital of infections, same thing. So Lou Ferrigno, famous bodybuilder, is on the same level as Gam Gam, who's dying in the hospital of sepsis and systemic infection.
Obviously, we recognize that this is a ridiculous situation.
Yeah,
I think something else I want to bring up too is like the reason why I eat meat. Maybe I should write an article or something like this on that. But I told you this before. It's like I appreciate all of the organisms that have gone to feed my body, but I also recognize myself as like inherently superior to a chicken or a pig or a cow. And I think those animals are fulfilling their duty, being a part of me as the higher cause.
All pieces of the puzzle.
Look, it's chicken, pigs, and cows will most likely also be the ones joining us up in space. So it's their sacrifice that's making this possible.
By being useful, they are securing their continued existence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing too is like the demand for meat. If the demand for meat goes away, then those domestic animals will also go away. And I think that's also something else to be talked about. And we have to take care of our animals. So I'm not saying that this is any justification to like beat your chicken constantly or your farm animals by any means. And I think the way that we've done factory farming is pretty disgusting. But at the same time, I don't think that that's any way to like swing the opposite direction and go for a diet that it seems a lot of people are unsuccessful at.
Yes, you have
If
to start
people,
from that first principles approach. Yes, factory farming is atrocious and heinous, and we can do better than that. But that's the second item to address, not the foundation of which to build that house on.
yeah, yeah,
Address
it's more of
the
that.
foundation and then build up.
Yeah, it's again that suboptimal thing of we have a lot of people to feed, and meat is really nutritionally dense, and we're taking advantage of these organisms that are able to feed off of things that we can't,
It's
but
incredible.
then we're able to feast off of them. So whether or not this is like justification for us to maybe have more of a hunter gatherer relationship with our society again, having areas in which we can go and hunt our own food more regularly, or maybe that just becomes more popular in society, however we want to do it, as a way to supplement factory farming to make it less, you know, uh, less evil. I don't know.
It is really beautiful and gives us hope for the future. And we can paint this majestic picture that whether it's grains placed there by humans or grass and other forms of grazing on petals and leaves of flowers and grasses, you have animals that consume grass, leaves, and other plants, flowers, and then they transform that into meat. It's incredible. All the components are there. We just need biological processes within life forms to transform them. Like plants, all day long, they're continuously splitting water molecules. They're literally splitting it, and no one bats an eye through photosynthesis, which is an insane chemical and quantum process to take energy from a giant nuclear fusion ball that's very far away from us, that's sending energy that hits this plant life form, which does photosynthesis, and then we redo and undo that process in reverse. Like photosynthesis is the opposite of glycolysis. So the plants make the sugars, and then we break down the sugars for energy, essentially as a
Mhm.
primary form of energy. There are other forms of energy, but that's one of the main ones. And so for all you vegetarians out there, you're killing those life forms. But so I just like pointing that out because it seems like it's much easier to attack meat eaters than it is, or they're at least more frequently attacked than plant eaters. But there are points to be addressed in all of these collectively omnivorous functions. And our food
Yeah,
sources are amazing, and we're alive because of all of them. Like many life forms died for our single organism to continue to survive. So
yep,
we should really be appreciative of how many shrimp died, how many chickens died, how many grains died just for me to make it this many years in my life is remarkable. So I can't get hung
absolutely.
up on like, oh, my Tinder date canceled on me. Yeah, it's like when in doubt, zoom out. Just zoom out and your perspective will change and you can recenter your focus and take in more information. And it just what a life to
Absolutely.
realize
I mean,
how remarkable our sentient existence is and our volition that we have choice. We're not only alive, but we're aware that we are alive and we have choice in that life.
Mhm.
That is remarkable.
Absolutely. I think it's just good to develop this level of respect having for the food that comes into your being and becomes a part of you necessarily. I mean, I think it's a great and a very beautiful thing to do, to like respect and eat all of the salmon, or all of the beef. Like, yeah, I feel like if you had to choose to throw away food, I would rather it be vegetables than animals, because maybe we have respect for that sort of complexity differential. But at the end of the day, I saying thank you to your food, I think, is actually like just a nice practice.
I agree. I agree.
So
Yeah.
to wrap this guy up, I think we have to say that obviously all the stuff that we're trying to give you, the audience, are tools in order for you to challenge yourself,
Yes.
to develop new lines of reasoning. And even when I sound angry, I'm doing that for your benefit. I don't want to, like, I am a very lovable guy, but it's also because that I love people that I have to push them. I got to be the person to push them sometimes. So I feel like I'm not doing it to chastise people needlessly. I think it's to bring them to a new level. And sometimes you need that competition, that sort of like breaking down the barriers in order to bring yourself back up again. It's like you go into the gym and lifting weights and stuff like that. You got to break down the muscle in order to build it up better again. So we'll challenge each other, and I think we'll get to higher ways of being because of it. Not to sound too new agey, but you know what? I already did it. So
You're good. Open discourse is the way for both sides, all sides, multi parties, to gain more information, gain perspective. We should be open to challenging our own ideas and to challenging other ideas. And if we truly believe what we believe, then we can continue to arrive at the same conclusion, even given more information, including information that is against our stance. And then also we might fine tune and adjust our own position given new information, which is also really the better outcome. We shouldn't be afraid to make concessions if they are founded appropriately, and just to continuously be receptive of new information and to critically analyze it and dissect it along with our own current values, beliefs, and figuring out the motives for those. It's like a game of Jenga with our own beliefs, right? So that's
yeah,
the game where you have the tower of little wood pieces and you're systematically testing it for structural instability. And we probably all have assumptions that might not be fully founded in our own belief systems. And it doesn't mean that Jenga tower has to fall, but we can take out this piece of plywood that is weaker than we thought it was, and then we can replace it with a stronger piece of wood. Like, ultimately, the goal is to improve. It's not to just adapt, or it's not just to adopt the opposition, so to speak, perspective. It's just to improve our own perspective and our own stance, because then we make a better life for ourselves, for our communities, for the globe. And then we become a spacefaring multiplanetary species, and we hedge our bets against cosmic events that could take out our entire species with a single event.
because the goal is survival. Absolutely. I think when it comes down to it, I think we have to recognize that the goal has always been survival. And we just can't be like stupid on this point, I guess. It's like, even if that's not your goal, it's like, okay, well, that's everyone else's goal. So I kind of don't care what those people think. They just seem to be an opponent more than helpful at that point in time. So it's like, okay, so we're going to go to space and then what? It's like, we'll figure it out then. It's like the important thing is just getting to that next step.
Yes.
Like I'm not particularly worried. There's meaning inherent, I think, in the survival. It's like, well, I'll have time to think on it.
Never give up. Yes, we're going to have time. I'm thinking of I think his name was Thomas Malthus, where he said that by the time the 1970s come around, because populations birth at increasingly exponential rates, but food only increases at a linear rate somehow, then the global population will starve and die off by 1970. Well, that never accounts for innovation and breakthroughs, scientific advancements. Uh, we have a tendency to oversimplify the variables of the future. It's not just dominoes that fall in a single linear fashion through a, even if it's a tortuous, twisting, winding pathway. There's actually so many things in place that you can never account for what the future holds. And here we are. We've never had more food. I mean, we literally have agricultural subsidies where we pay people to not grow food on their farmland in order to keep prices higher so people make money. So we're choosing money over food, and our population doesn't really seem to be suffering that much. There are still, yes, there are population declines in certain areas of the world, but ultimately, when in doubt, zoom out. So we can't miss the forest for the trees. And the end result is there are still over 7 billion people on this planet, and there weren't before. So we can argue all these smaller points, but at the other side of that equation, on the other side of the equal sign, is 7 billion plus people. So we're going to be around for a while longer. People will find a way to survive. People live on every continent, even researchers living on Antarctica. People eat just about everything. People live in various environmental climates. People eat meat. People eat plants. People eat mostly meat. People eat mostly plants. People are omnivorous. People are starving. People are eating in excess, and they're still around.
Yep.
People, disease, endemic, pandemics. We're still here.
I think too that if people think that we're being too general about these points, to kind of like gloss over some of the problems specifically in our food chain, I would just like to remind them that we already see like the thought that you have is already proof that progress is already sort of inbuilt. You know, the fact that we went from supermarkets that don't carry or differentiate between organic and inorganic, or I should say like non-organic, not inorganic. There's no inorganic apples. That's not what I'm trying to say. Organic apples versus, you know, those that have had pesticides and blah, blah, blah. And then the fact that we also find problems with organics, you know, that we've even made that purity even lesser to a standard that we've created. We're always creating new standards and going towards them. There's never been more wild caught food and organic meats and vegetables and stuff like that. We are always, I think, going towards this more you know, interesting ideal. We just have to take hits every once in a while. I think, you know, when you go to a factory setting, you're going to lose out on certain things, but you'll also be gaining things in different ways, namely quantity.
Always a trade-off. It's just, does the benefit outweigh the cost? Like flowers, we've genetically modified them so they look prettier for longer, but they've lost their smell. Tomatoes, we've made it so they're larger, juicier, but they're less nutrient dense, but everybody has access to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like, and like, we just made those improvements in one area, but the other area will catch up. We will, like, part of efficiency is having not too much of a trade-off in future products.
And we can't refuse to move forward because the forward progress is imperfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you said, we'll figure it out when we get there. And we can't predict all the problems that we will encounter until we are there. It's just like when you have a prototype, once it is implemented in real life through use and use by millions, things are discovered, like program bugs. Just to use a common example, we have the iPhone, they write a software update. Those people are very smart. They're the best in the industry. There are still bugs and there are still updates because it was imperfect.
Mhm. Absolutely. It's, we just have to push back on our own inherent snobbery that our advanced civilization has sort of cultured. Just push back against the snobbery. That's all you have to do. Just kind of be a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more open, and a little bit more tolerant of the way that people are. And I think we'll kind of improve it as a civilization because of it.
That sounds good to me. I will work to improve myself.
And I hope that everyone else in the audience does as well, as we will continue to do, and we'll do so together. So I think thank you everyone for who's made it this far in our long-winded and rambling conversation to cover all the topics that we wish we could cover and more.
Absolutely. We thank you for joining us.